Hello, I am Suresh Kumar, Assistant Professor and Head, Department of English, St.Joseph College of Arts and Science, Cuddalore. Let's discuss today Philip Sidney's An Apology for Poetry. So let's begin with his life and work. Sidney was born in 1554 in England. His Astrophel and Stella is a collection of songs and sonnets, and Arcadia is a prose work. In 1579, Stephen Gosson published a pamphlet called The School of Abuse. Gosson attacked the art of the age, especially the drama. As a Puritan, Sidney replied with his apology for poetry. He showed his classicism by his approval of plays built on Latin model. He supported English poetry. Let's now have a view of a detailed summary of An Apology for Poetry. Sidney and his friend Edward Wharton attended the court of Maximilian II and met Pigiliano. He was a royal stabler. He praised horses. He said the prince should learn horsemanship first, and the art of cow can be easily learned from books. He praised so much that Sidney wanted to become a horse himself. He also said that every man should love his profession. Poetry is Sidney's profession. Poetry is in a despicable state. Children and philosophers condemn it. Let's now analyze Sidney's views about poetry. According to Sidney, poetry enlightens people. Poets were the first light givers. Poets strengthen feeble-minded people. Poetry enjoys an ancestry which other branches do not. Ancient philosophers wrote in verse. Sidney says that it is imagination which is the hallmark of poetry and not versification. A person who rejects it cannot experience the delights of poetry. Sidney says that historians have also borrowed manner and substance from poets. Ancient historians used poetic devices such as describing passion in passionate manner, long orations as in dramas. Historians have also extended the gift of popular judgment. Historians do not have the element of imagination. Poetry was held high in ancient countries. For example, in Turkey, poets were on par with divines who prescribed laws for people to follow. In Ireland, the arts are not included in learning, but still poets are revered. Barbarous West Indians sing songs in praise of their great men, so that these savages can be civilized by developing a liking for poetry. The Romans called the poet greats or divine prophetic prophets. Romans thought that the poets could foresee future happenings. Poetry has a divine force. David, the ancient Jewish king and author of Psalm in the Old Testament, was words of the noblest kind. Such heavenly poetry, says Sidney, has a due place in the church. In Greek, the word poet means to make. Sydney says that all arts and science are connected with nature either directly or indirectly. Arts express nature in their own way. Example, astronomers study the stars, mathematicians study quantities, and musicians through sounds in nature. Lawyers, grammarians, physicians too get a lot from nature. Sydney says that poetry is better than nature, as the poet creates idealist portraits of men and women who cannot be found anywhere in the world. Example, poet create one-eyed cyclops, fairies, etc. Sydney argues that the poet creates letters that are model of virtues. Sydney says that the poet characters are better than the characters created by God, as they are trained by the original sin. Sydney says the poet offers speaking pictures, poetry teaches and delight. Sydney divides poetry into three categories. So let's see now the different kinds of poetry. 1. Religious poetry. Its prime importance is concerned with inconceivable excellencies of God. Second, philosophical poetry. Tyrtaeus, Virgil, and Lucan are philosophical poets. They offer the sweet food of sweetly uttered knowledge. Sydney says there is something wrong with taste and judgment, who dislike philosophical poetry. The third kind of poets teach and delight. They teach not what is, but what may be. Sydney compares philosophical poets with painters. Painters cannot paint objects which they cannot see. Sydney says that meter or verse form is only an external dress and does not constitute the essence of poetry. Many writers use verse forms but are lacking essential element. They are called versifiers and not poets. Sydney stresses that poetry has to be serious, with each word chosen carefully to maintain dignity of the subject. The poet should not talk casually. Sydney says that the end of all learning is to attain the highest level of perfection. Astrologers fail, it makes them impracticable. Students of science think themselves as demigods. They are blind to their defects. Mathematics does not ennoble the learners. The highest end of all learning is not well-knowing, but well-doing. The moral philosophers cannot claim to be superior to the poet. He attacked others for carrying books, but he himself has always a book in his hand. He angrily shouts at people for being angry. The weakness of philosopher is that he thinks it's possible to reform people through dry logic. Historian claims that they are the evidence of time and the light of truth. His teaching is theoretical and unsuited to actual life. But the historian says that he derives wisdom. Philosophers actually give a song book in the learner's hand. But actually, singing is done by the historian. Sydney says that the historian findings are based on rumors. He always turns to the past and never views the present. Lawyer helps people of fear of punishment for wicked deeds than art of love or virtue. Only history, philosophy, and poetry claim to remove man's naughtiness. Philosophy and history have limitations. Philosophers lack of imagination and historians lack of general doctrine. But the poet gives a perfect picture which can be understood and enjoyed. History has shortcomings. History deals with particular, whereas poetry is concerned with universal. The poet states what qualities to emulate and what to avoid, unlike history. Historians argue that what happened in the past will happen in the present also. Sidney dismisses it. Sidney cites examples of Xenophon, a poet, who superior to Herodotus, a historian. History is inferior to poetry because it shows vice triumphing over virtue. Philosophy has no moving power. Only poetry is capable of moving minds. The poet narrates tales which cross everyone. Tales convey bitter moral truths, which is like sugarcoating a bitter medicine. Great poetry has a moving power which is lacking in philosophy. A philosopher are different to understand. Even Epicureans are delighted by poetry. Philosophers involve only in discussion. Poetry is most effective in promoting virtue. Sidney undertakes to examine various kinds of poetry. Tragic comedy is an example. Sometimes heroic and pastoral forms are combined. Sidney is aware of the shortcomings of comedy, but there is no inherent evil in comedy. It only exposes foibles and failings. Sidney says that one has to know both good and evil. Thus, comedy serves as a corrective. Tragedy is superior to comedy as it deals with the great maladies affecting mankind. Sidney discusses lyrical poetry which praises virtuous actions, human problems, and immortal God. Sidney pays a glowing tribute to heroic or epic poetry. Example, Virgil's Aeneas. According to Sidney, there are certain poetasters who seek recognition for themselves by condemning poets. They have neither knowledge nor wisdom. Sidney says rhyme and verse are not necessary for poetry. The poet's language becomes musical and strikes the sense easily. Also, versifying helps memory. There are 4 charges against poetry. The first charge is that it is a waste of time to study poetry. Sidney says that only poetry teaches us and moves to virtue. The second charge is against the poet is that he is a liar. He cannot be a liar because he never undertakes to tell the truth. The poet is concerned not only with what is, but with what should be. He gives imaginary pictures of law people should like and go about. The poet supplies only profitable inventions, and it is wrong to look in them for literary truth. The third criticism is that poetry abuses man's mind by planting sinful thoughts in it. Sidney tries to defend poetry by arguing first that even great philosophers have spoken in praise of love. The second argument is that love of beauty is not a beastly fault, but a gift that only man possesses. Sydney's third and most powerful argument is that it is not poetry that abuses man's mind, but man's mind that abuses poetry. Sydney says that no object is good or bad in itself. It all depends on user's attitude. It is said that poetry makes men effeminate. Ancient gods who attacked Rome and were known for their heroism were great lovers of poetry. The fourth criticism against poetry is that even the great Greek philosophers, Plato, has objected to the poet and banished him from his ideal commonwealth. Sidney says that it is strange that Plato, whose own works with poetry, should condemn it. Many philosophers hate poets out of sheer jealousy. Sidney says that poets are able to humanize tyrants. Plato's main complaint against poets is that they present a detailed version of the gods. Sidney's point is that the poet did not induce such opinions, but nourished their beliefs. Plato himself has praise of the divine nature of poet, his inspiration in his law. All great rulers favored poetry. Alexander, Caesar, Socrates regarded poetry in high esteem by showing how great Greek writers held poetry in high range. Sidney dismisses all the charges against poetry as beneath one's notice. Thank you.